I'm not sure if I've got the slideshare working yet.
No, you have not.
All right, let me try again. But somehow now I've lost the slideshare. Oh, Paul, all these years and I'm still finding ways to mess it up. All right, I guess I need to close that system, go to the share. And where is Thomas Murphy? Slideshow.
You're not sharing screen yet.
How do we get him?
No,
Do we have him now?
no, we're not showing that you're sharing your screen yet, Paul.
Oh, wow. Well, let's try again. For some reason, it's coming up with allow Zoom Workplace to share your screen rather than just simply allowing me to open the screen. So if you can tell me what I've done wrong here, I would appreciate it, because I shouldn't have to go through that step. Share. But again, it's not allowing me to show the PowerPoint.
Sounds
It's
like
not going to
sunscreen.
your, sorry, go ahead.
Well, under the circumstances, since I have not been successful at getting the screen share to work, I'm going to go ahead and make the introduction anyway, and offer the prayer, and then we'll turn it over to Brother Murphy. Thomas Murphy gave us in his first session some couple of years back, provide an open mic for the First Nations people, he said. And that phrase really struck me because there are so many of the First Nations people whose voices have been muted and who have something significant to share with us. And that presentation, I believe, was the one on the Popol Vuh with its 4 stages of creation. And I think that the insight is one of the key insights we've learned in the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum. He leads the Learn and Serve Environmental Anthropology Field School at Edmonds Community College in Washington. His cross-cultural interests covered with those of the Rainbow Eagle, the Choctaw, who has stepped up to our open mics on several occasions, and for us to appreciate the scientific evidence from archaeology and ethnography, but more especially to open the mic to hear the voices, the ideas, and the genius of native speakers, some of the other sheep whom the Christ visited, offers an exciting pathway to peace and understanding. And so I thank you, Thomas, for bringing back your scientific discipline and religious fortitude back to our forum, and for highlighting the need to appreciate both scientific and religious authority. Please pray with me. And I would have a picture of the medicine wheel, the sacred hoop, if I could get it in front of you. Creator of the sacred hoop, the cycle of life, the circles of the seasons, the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth in all its wonderful inhabitants, multi-legged, four-legged, two-legged, those who swim and those who fly. We acknowledge you as Great Spirit, beyond yet within all existence we can identify. And this evening on Zoom, in 2 dimensions, we seek to expand our appreciation beyond the tensions in our own nation, to embrace a bit of your creation obscure to us, but not to your all-seeing eye. Our understanding in the empires of our commanding pales to insignificance in the awesome galaxies you have created beyond our Milky Way stars. And on this beautiful earth where we mortals have had the privilege of birth, we have messed up to the point some of us want to go elsewhere, perhaps to Mars, where our pollutions will not stink, and with clear minds we might be caused to think as we acknowledge our missing our goals, our memoir. And so we pause to ask your blessing on our gathering with Thomas Murphy presenting, that our meaning and belonging here on earth be spotlighted and enculturated, and that we open to hear, to see, to grasp, to learn the concepts we have yet to clasp, to live together in peace, that goal so underrated. And that we embrace all that is good within our brotherhood, within the messages you have implanted in all you have created. We address you in awe, in the names of those who have walked the paths of peace before. Amen. Thomas, I hope you have better luck getting on the screen share than I did.
Well, I'm going to try it right now here. Is that
Yes, you're coming through science and fiction.
okay? Let's see. Whoa, okay. There we go. Okay. So you're seeing the science and fiction. There we go.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. I want to begin by thanking Paul and Robert and Deb in particular for the invitation to come back and for your hosting this place that I think of as rather an eclectic group of people who share a fascination with the Book of Mormon, but often approach it from a wide variety of different perspectives. And it's an honor to have presented here before on my article from the Journal of Mormon History that Paul just mentioned. That article was called An Insufficient Canon, the Popol Vuh, Book of Mormon and Other Scriptures. And that article that won the John Whitmer Historical Association's Best Theology and Scripture Writing Award that year. And it was an honor to share that. There's a lot of similarity between that article and the one I have to share today, entitled Science and Fiction, Kennewick Man, Ancient One, and Latter-day Saint Discourse. I want to begin by acknowledging the Coast Salish people, especially the Stahobes or the Snohomish people, on whose land I reside and who have welcomed my family into the community. The Stahobes are represented today by the federally recognized Tulalip tribes and the municipally recognized Snohomish tribe. And I have featured a few photos of members of the Snohomish tribe with me and my students on tribal canoe journey, traveling the ancient pathways of the ancestors in the Salish Sea. That picture of all the canoes lined up along the bottom is at Bella Bella, which is about halfway to Alaska from where we are here on the Puget Sound. And the gathering of nations to share in culture and protocols. And it's been an honor for me to be able to support the Coast Salish nations in their work. And that experience strongly shapes my approach to the topic that we're here to discuss today. We're here to discuss a publication in the Journal of Northwest Anthropology. This is a mainstream academic journal and one of the rare peer-reviewed articles on the Book of Mormon to appear in a mainstream academic journal. The article is co-authored by Simon Southerton, a geneticist from Australia, and by Angelo Baca, a Dene and Hopi anthropologist from, at that time I think he was still at New York University. He's now at Rhode Island School of Design, where he is an assistant professor in Native American film in one of the best film schools in the world. And Angelo and Simon contributed significantly to this article. So when I'm sharing, I'm going to be sharing not just my own ideas, but the ideas that I have built in collaboration with them. And what I wanted to do, rather than say last time I'd spent a lot of time reading selections from the article, but this time I wanted to do a little more of an informal approach where I talk first, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the article, but then I'm going to talk about how the article came to be. And that's an interesting story that actually surprisingly overlaps significantly with the content of the article. But basically, the goal of this article was that we wanted to bring together the scientific community represented by Simon Southerton, the indigenous community represented by Angelo Baca, and see if we couldn't find some common ground around the science related to especially DNA and Native Americans and the study of the Book of Mormon. Could we find some common agreement with each other? And if we can find that common agreement with each other, can we deliver that in a manner that is of the highest standards, that it could pass peer review in a mainstream academic journal? And that was our challenge. We used the case study of Kennewick Man, or the Ancient One, who was a skeleton found here in Washington State along the Columbia River in 1997, and became a subject of significant interest and dispute, in part over how the Army Corps of Engineers, who owned the property on which the skeleton of the Ancient One was found, how should the Army Corps of Engineers engage with the tribal communities who claimed this skeleton as their ancestor? And how might that process occur? This was a contentious debate that was much in the public arena, with some anthropologists, some scientists opposing an indigenous involvement in the discussion of the skeleton, and trying to exclude indigenous voices and perspectives from the analysis of what, not just the analysis, but what should be done with these remains of their ancestor. It was deeply troubling to me. Here, I was here in Washington State, a graduate student at the University of Washington, and because of the perspective of some of these scientists, it was like a black eye to anthropologists in the indigenous communities that I was working in, and so it presented this case study that we use to rethink debates over the Book of Mormon, its historicity, its geographies, and essentially offer an indigenous alternative to the debates between the Heartland advocates and the Mesoamerican advocates. And we articulate an emerging indigenous alternative that would treat the Book of Mormon not as a determinative singular history of the Americas, but as one of many. In fact, a particularly settler colonial perspective about indigenous origins. And we wanted to articulate this indigenous alternative to the debates over the Book of Mormon. So how did this all come about? How did we end up there? And I should say, in this picture, there's also an evidence that we were at least somewhat successful in our endeavors, because not only did we pass the scientific peer review, but this article won an award from the Mormon History Association. It's called the May Timbimbu Perry Best Indigenous Studies Award. This award honors an important historian from the Northwestern Shoshone, May Timbimbu Perry. And it won that award. So we were able to please both the scientific community and the indigenous community with the results. And that made us particularly proud of that accomplishment. I want to kind of now back up and provide a little bit of background, a little bit about me and about why I wanted to approach the subject in this manner, a little bit about my collaborations with Simon Southerton and Angelo Baca, how the three of us could come together and produce this particular article. I was raised in southern Idaho. I was actually born in Los Angeles, California, but my parents were from southern Idaho, and I was raised there with stories of and the stories were of an Indian princess in our family tree, a term that I would find later was quite offensive in the native communities that I worked in. But it was a story of Iroquois ancestors that sparked an interest in me in both indigenous studies and my Mormon heritage, and trying to bring them together. I pursued an undergraduate degree at the University of Iowa in anthropology and religion, kind of trying to combine that science and the humanities, kind of trying to look at things from both perspectives. In particular, I was concerned about things I'd heard from colleagues, particularly evangelical colleagues, about archaeology in the Book of Mormon and problems with archaeology in the Book of Mormon. And so I wanted to, well, no offense to Chris Thomas here, but I didn't trust the evangelicals. And so I wanted to hear it directly from the anthropologists, the archaeologists, and pursued a degree with in anthropology as well as in religion. Of course, being at the University of Iowa was a great place to interact with the various branches of the restoration. So the first academic conference I ever presented at was the John Whitmer Historical Association in Lamoni, Iowa, in I think that would have been about 1994, might have been 95. And I presented on peyote and the word of wisdom. And I went on to pursue a master's and PhD in anthropology from the University of Washington, and I earned that PhD in 2003. I'm probably best known in Book of Mormon studies for writing the first peer-reviewed article on DNA in the Book of Mormon. That was published in 2001 in an now defunct online journal known as Mormon Scripture Studies, and reprinted the following year in American Apocrypha, which is where most people know this article from. It was entitled Lamanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics. And I pursued this article with a request that came to me through Brent Metcalf, who was the editor of Mormon Scripture Studies, that there was an LDS philanthropist who wanted to support an article summarizing like a literature review of DNA research into Native American origins and its implications for the study of the Book of Mormon. And I agreed to take on that task. It fit well with my graduate studies, my interest in both science and in religion. And the result was Lamanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics. As some of you may recall, that was a controversial article in particular because it demonstrated very clearly that there was no affirmative DNA evidence for the claims of an Israelite migration to the Americas. And that did not sit well, obviously, with many people who were tied to historical claims of the Book of Mormon as a measure of its validity. rather than say its spiritual claims or its status as scripture. That article spawned a series of other articles. The John Whitmer Historical Association invited me to Independence to present the spring banquet in 2005. I presented an essay that would then be published in the Journal of the John Whitmer Historical Association entitled Sin, Skin, and Seed, Mistakes of Men in the Book of Mormon. And in this article, I tried to use the Book of Mormon narrative itself, its willingness to acknowledge that it has errors as a way of responding to the DNA research, that maybe we could exercise a little humility on our part in recognizing that some of those historical claims might be among the mistakes of men in the Book of Mormon. And not just the historical claims, but particularly the claims about race and skin color. And those have clearly also been shown by the genetics to not be linked to, let's say, the idea that a dark skin is a curse from God for wickedness. There is no genetic evidence to support a relationship between behavior and skin color. Instead, it's more of a natural process. And so the article outlines that as well as the DNA research. There was also a follow-up article dealing more directly with a Mesoamerican setting for the Book of Mormon. What does the DNA evidence show for that? That appeared in Dialogue. And again, just like throughout the Americas, if we take a broad hemispheric approach, there is no affirmative DNA evidence to support a Mesoamerican setting for the Book of Mormon any more than anywhere else in the Americas. I also collaborated with this geneticist from Australia who was working on a book about DNA in the Book of Mormon at the same time that I was working on this article. And there was an effort to excommunicate me from the LDS Church by my stake president, Matthew Latimer. And this created quite a stir in the news. And Simon and I came together to bring some of his analysis from his book together with my literature review and produced an article for Anthropology News in February of 2003 entitled Genetic Research, a Galileo Event for Mormons, with the idea that actually that started with Brent Metcalf, who had proposed in a Sunstone symposium that DNA could be like a Galileo event in which it's paradigm shifting in the field of Book of Mormon studies. And so we were analyzing the possibility that DNA could really change the paradigm for Book of Mormon studies. Fortunately, my stake president got wiser as he learned a little more about the research itself and decided that excommunication was probably not a good idea. And he backed off from that. A few years later, the LDS Church would change the introduction to its versions of the Book of Mormon, where it previously had said that the Lamanites were the principal ancestors of the American Indians. It changed to say they are among the ancestors of the American Indians. And this was an introduction that had been written in 1981 and included with LDS publications. So that possibility of a paradigm shift started to appear that it may in fact be happening. Certainly what we started to see was a shift from hemispheric readings of the Book of Mormon, which were fairly common, towards limited geographic settings and more tolerance for non-historical interpretations of the Book of Mormon as well. Now, although I'm best known for that work on DNA, what I'm less well known for, although certainly some of you that are part of the Mormon History Association or the John Whitmer Historical Association will know some of my other work, or that I've presented here on the Popol Vuh, where my primary goal has been to engage indigenous scholarship in Book of Mormon studies. This is apparent in my doctoral dissertation, which does include the DNA. There's a chapter on DNA in the Book of Mormon. That's what gets all the attention, but the rest of the book is about what indigenous scholars are saying about the Book of Mormon, what in dialogue with what anthropologists, archaeologists are saying, and what indigenous people, mostly within the LDS Church, are saying about themselves and their relationship to a Lamanite identity. In particular, I highlighted the scholarship of scholars like the Dakota scholar Vine Deloria Jr., the Osage and Cherokee scholar George Tinker, and their critiques of science and of the Book of Mormon, and I tried to bring the many publications that indigenous scholars had made over the years, commenting on the Book of Mormon, bring them together into one place and into dialogue with uh, the field of Book of Mormon studies more generally. Besides engaging indigenous scholars both inside and outside of the various branches of the restoration, I also focused on a particular branch in central Mexico, uh, known as El Reino de Dios en su plenitud, or the Kingdom of God in its fullness. This was a group founded by a Nahua theologian by the name of Margarito Bautista. And Margarito Bautista, for those who are not familiar with him, is the most prolific of the earliest indigenous scholars of the Book of Mormon. And his work from the 1930s through the 50s, well, actually, some of it started in the 20s through the 1950s, is still largely unknown in English-speaking communities. And so a big part of what I was trying to do in a chapter in the dissertation and in a couple of articles along with it, one published in Ethnohistory entitled From Racist Stereotype to Ethnic Identity, Instrumental Uses of Mormon Racial Doctrine. I look at the differing ways that indigenous Mexicans and Anglo-Mexicans interpreted the Book of Mormon, particularly its passages in relationship to race and skin color. And highlighting the work of Margarito Bautista and another scholar, Agricolo Lozano Herrera, another Nahua Mormon, and in fact, a president of the LDS Temple in Mexico, a stake president and a regional representative, so high up in the hierarchy of the LDS Church. I published an article featuring both Bautista and Lozano Herrera's work in the Journal of Mormon History called Other Mormon Histories, Lamanite Subjectivity in Mexico. And again, the purpose of this was to highlight a largely neglected body of literature, which at the time was the largest body of literature by an indigenous Latter-day Saint, I think, of any of the restoration branches. Today, maybe some scholars like Farina King might be passing him up in the number of words published, but we are, you know, it's probably taken until recently for there to be anything comparable in terms of indigenous scholarship to this author from Mexico writing in the 1920s through the 50s. In addition to that focus on indigenous Mexican scholars, when the story of my near excommunication reached the news, I was contacted by a young man at the University of Washington that I had known actually already through some cartoons he had published in a student newspaper at the University of Washington. I'd known of him, but I'd never met him personally. His name was Angelo Baca. He was a Diné and Hopi student of anthropology at the time, and would later pursue a master's in communication in the native film program at the University of Washington. And he took the work that I did in my dissertation, Imagining Lamanites, and reworked it, looked at it from an indigenous perspective, and produced a film called In Layman's Terms, Looking at Lamanite Identity. In the film, he does interview me and Simon Southerton, but most of the focus is on indigenous peoples, both LDS and non-LDS, who have something to say about the Book of Mormon claims about Lamanites, about American Indians, and tries to feature those voices, even those that disagree with his own perspective. And this film, published in 2008, still to this day, I don't think has received the credit it deserves within the field of Book of Mormon studies. And as we'll see, that was a major reason for me to want to come back and do some more work with Angelo. I will say that I put in the comments a link to this slideshow with active links to these films and the various publications I'm discussing. We won't have time for me to show all of them here. So I just want to let you know that if you want to have an easy way to access this material and dig a little deeper, to follow that link, and you will see active links that you can, on your own time, examine this film or some of the other scholarship that I've discussed. In the years after my dissertation, which I completed in 2003, I had, for the practicalities of finding employment and keeping my family in the Pacific Northwest, and in the same high school that my daughter was attending, trying to prioritize the needs of my family, and finding a job locally. I found a job at Edmonds Community College, which is just north of Seattle. So I didn't have to leave the Seattle area. I didn't have to leave even the same high school that my daughter had started attending. She was able to finish her degree at her high school, and I was able to pursue a career. However, community colleges don't have big Book of Mormon studies programs, and so I had to take a broader perspective to my work. And at the center of that was already a collaboration between indigenous scholarship and science. And so I built at Edmonds Community College what Paul described earlier, the Learn and Serve Environmental Anthropology Field School, or the LEAF School, as we call it. That was a partnership with Coast Salish nations, government agencies, nonprofit organizations, to combine the use of indigenous science and Western science together to solve common problems, to address common goals. And this gave me an incredible opportunity to work closely with many tribal elders, to spend extended amounts of time in the community. This was an outdoor field-based field school, for most of the time running year-round, with a very intensive component during the summer where we traveled on tribal canoe journey, where we would travel for weeks to months at a time on the ancestral pathways, using a combination of the best tools and techniques of modern science and transportation technology, along with the ancestral knowledge of these waterways, involving elders with their traditional knowledge, alongside our GPS and our NOAA predicted weather reports and stuff, to make decisions about how we're going to navigate the various waterways. We also did important projects like bringing salmon back to the site of the Point Elliott Treaty, where we used traditional knowledge about fish and wildlife, to monitor our local streams in the site in where the treaty had been signed with Coast Salish nations, promising them that they could continue to harvest fish in perpetuity, for forever, in return for the United States being able to come into, the citizens of the United States being able to come into their territory. This was a promise that was made in 1855, but it was less than a century before fish had been eradicated from the streams in the shadows of that very treaty that they had signed. So we worked together with tribal biologists, with scientists from NOAA, with city of Mukilteo, Snohomish County, scientists and staff to bring salmon back to that site. And you can see in the photo here a picture of salmon returned to the treaty site. So that was, some example of some of the type of work that I was engaged in outside of Mormon studies and less known within Mormon studies. The Journal of Northwest Anthropology is published in our region by a group that hosts an annual conference known as the Northwest Anthropology Conference. That Northwest Anthropology Conference is a place where I was regularly bringing my students, the tribal leaders we were working with. We were presenting throughout about our work, what we were doing in the community, sharing the results of our research, of our restoration projects. And in these same conferences, the tribal scientists and tribal leaders were talking about Kennewick Man and the Ancient One. These are the same people that we were partnering with in salmon habitat restoration work, were the same, many of them at least, were the same scientists, anthropologists, working on advocating for the tribes to have access to their own ancestors, and to be able to protect their own ancestors and make decisions about what's done with the skeletal remains of their ancestors. And so I was deeply engaged in that Kennewick Man, Ancient One discussion, as well as sharing the results of this restoration work. When my wife had a stroke, as Paul mentioned in the introduction, about a little over 6 years ago, I was not able to continue as intensively the field school work that I had previously done. Now it's carried on by my Dr. Hugo Puerto, who is a Colombian anthropologist, who is teaching my classes not only in English, but also in Spanish. So the work continues. Today, I play more of a supportive role. But as I was kind of stepping back from that more active role in running the field school, I wrote an article for the Journal of Northwest Anthropology called "No One Asked for an Ethnography: Reflections on Community-Based Anthropology in Coast Salish Country." And this article would be important because it's going to lead to the invitation to write the article, Science and Fiction. And so it was summarizing the work that we were doing in the community, bringing together the best of Indigenous science with the best of Western science and addressing common problems. And there were some other there's some other focus on that work as well, and some of our ethnobotanical gardens and trails that we built were also featured in the Journal of Northwest Anthropology. Some of the work that we were doing in the field also involved combining the Indigenous science of wildlife tracking with the latest technology in motion sensitive wildlife cameras or camera traps. And I became part of this, what's now a global network of scientists and Indigenous, both Western and Indigenous scientists, using a combination of the camera trap technology with Indigenous wildlife science to better understand how we could more effectively manage our wildlife throughout the globe. We've produced a number of publications combining Western science and indigenous science. These are some examples in global change biology, disturbance type and species life history predict mammal responses to humans. We're taking this very large data sets of pictures of animals that we've collected and at the Smithsonian and doing large data analysis of them with statistical inferences and predictions. Other examples of global camera trap synthesis highlights the importance of protected areas and maintaining mammal diversity in conservation letters. And in conservation biology, combining camera trap surveys and IUCN range maps to improve knowledge of species distributions. And in Diversity and Distributions, a Journal of Conservation Biogeography, our most recent one, Climate, Food, and Humans, predict communities of mammals in the United States. And I highlight this work to show what can happen when indigenous scientists and Western scientists work together collaboratively. We're starting to make an impact globally on building respect for indigenous knowledge and ensuring that it's included in policy decisions in countries around the world. Well, how did I come back to Mormon studies when I got involved in all of that stuff? I was having a lot of fun. I didn't have time for Mormon studies. It really took a backseat for almost a decade for me. But I got an invitation in 2014 from Nova Religio, which is a journal, the Journal of Alternative and Emergent Religions. They had a copy of a new book by Paul Gutjahr called The Book of Mormon, a Biography. And they asked me if I would review the book. Now, I had reviewed a book back in 2002 by Terrell Gibbons called By the Hand of Mormon, the American Scripture that Launched a New World Religion for the Journal of Mormon History. And what I found in both of these books published, over a decade apart from each other, a very similar problem. Neither book, despite being still today some of the leading academic press articles or books about the Book of Mormon, neither one cites an indigenous author. Neither one even discusses people like Margarito Bautista. They do discuss, or at least the second one discusses my DNA research, but it neglects all the indigenous scholarship that I tried to bring into the field of Book of Mormon studies. And I was deeply troubled by the fact that despite the work that I did in the 1990s and in the early 2000s to try to bring indigenous voices into a more prominent place within Book of Mormon studies, that I generally failed. I'd failed. And I knew I needed a different approach. Meanwhile, the church had gone a little bit further than simply changing, the LDS Church had gone a little bit further than simply changing the introduction to the Book of Mormon. It actually published an essay called Book of Mormon and DNA Studies that largely confirms the conclusions I had reached in Laymanite Genesis, genealogy, and genetics, that there is no genetic evidence to support Israelite migrations to the New World. And what it does instead is offer some explanations for why that DNA evidence might have disappeared. But more important than that, from my perspective, is it emphasizes that the primary purpose of the Book of Mormon is more spiritual than historical. Another thing that happened besides the LDS Church publishing this essay, we saw in the aftermath of the work on DNA, the foundation, well, it actually started even before the work on DNA. We saw a decline in the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies at BYU. It's the publications that it was presenting decreased in number, and eventually Farms was replaced by the Maxwell Institute that takes a very different approach to scholarship. Instead of taking a largely apologetic response to issues, that the Maxwell Institute is trying to engage in mainstream academic discourse and involve more Latter-day Saint scholars in that discourse, so that they have a voice and a place within the larger academic community. And that approach is largely replaced the role of Farms, at least at BYU. There is, of course, the Interpreter Foundation that spins off of this and continues with some of the same scholars, arguing for a Mesoamerican setting for the Book of Mormon. And as we'll discuss in a minute, there is an alternative Heartland group that emerges. Well, so we've got the church now acknowledging at least the credibility of the research that I was citing. And so there's an opportunity still, I think, to build a collaborative approach in Book of Mormon studies. And so we're talking about I did that article in 2014. By about 2016, actually 2015, I am corresponding and meeting with Angelo Baca to say, all right, what if I were to come back into Book of Mormon studies, how could we, or would you be interested in being a part of this? He was still somewhat active in Mormon studies, but more so in Indigenous studies. But as you know, what are the needs, I asked, that Indigenous communities are wanting to see addressed? Because what made the work so successful around wildlife monitoring, or about tribal canoe journey, or about restoring salmon habitat, what made it successful is that the scientists and the Western scientists and the Indigenous scientists had common goals. So what are some common goals that Book of Mormon scholars and those of us coming from a more scientific perspective, as well as those not, what are some goals that we could come together with Indigenous scholars to begin advocating for? And the result of that was an essay that Angelo and I wrote for Open Theology. And this essay was published in 2016, entitled Rejecting Racism in Any Form, Latter-day Saint Rhetoric, Religion, and Repatriation. It was repatriation that Angelo emphasized was the primary area that we could have a place that we could come together around. And the repatriation is in some cases legally mandated now under the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act. Institutions with federal funding are required to engage in good faith with tribal communities around the tribes having a say in what's done with the cultural and physical remains of their ancestors. And what if we brought that sort of approach from happening with legally mandated NAGPRA negotiations? What if we brought something like that into Book of Mormon studies? What would that look like? And we could see with the church's recent essays, not just on DNA, but the essay Rejecting Racism in Any Form, that there's really an opening here for collaboration and partnership. If Latter-day Saints of any stripe are serious about rejecting racism in any form, then we need to discuss who would have owned the gold plates to begin with. And if the gold plates probably shouldn't have belonged to Joseph Smith or to settlers in general, but instead to the Seneca people on whose land they were found, what could we do to repatriate those gold plates? Well, the plates themselves might be hard to return because we don't know where they are, right? Or maybe the angel took them. But there are seer stones that are in the possession of the community of Christ. There are seer stones that are in possession of the LDS Church. There are seer stones in the hands of private collectors that are significant archaeological artifacts for indigenous people. What if we return some of those? What sort of opportunity might that provide for building relationships and sustaining those relationships? So that article examines that. It also is our first response to the rising Heartland movement, where we discuss it within the context of other white nationalist movements that were legitimizing grave robbery, opposing the Bears Ears National Monument, the Mormon militia that occupied the Malheur Wildlife Refuge. We saw that the Heartland group is kind of in a similar sort of vein in terms of rejecting indigenous claims to their own patrimony, to their own ancestors, and particularly with the way that Heartland advocates were racializing DNA in a way that is inconsistent with the science, the genetics. It's claiming that certain lineages, the X2A lineage was a European lineage, when there's absolutely no scientific basis for that claim. It's a racializing of the DNA in a way that is inconsistent with the science. So Angela and I produced this article. We were also asked, both of us were asked around this time to participate in a couple of anthologies that are basically trying to create dialogue between indigenous and non-indigenous scholars related to Mormonism. The first of these is edited by Gina Colvin, a Maori scholar, then a member of the LDS Church. She's now a member of the Community of Christ. And Joanna Brooks, a literary scholar in San Diego. They produced a volume called Decolonizing Mormonism, Approaching a Post-Colonial Zion. Both Angela and I published a couple of articles in there. Mine tells kind of the story of me coming back to Mormon studies and starting to imagine what would a collaborative approach look like. And then we were both invited, although Angela had to decline the invitation, to Brigham Young University by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies. I don't remember if I've got the title exactly right. But the history department at Brigham Young University asked us to collaborate on essays on American Indian and Mormon history. This anthology is to take a approach to the writing of history that values and engages respectfully and centers indigenous voices. And for that, I produced an article talking about other scriptures, that is Iroquois or Haudenosaunee sacred texts, and the relationship to the Book of Mormon, a subject that I will elaborate more in the future in a book that will be coming out next year, and hopefully I'll be back to talk about that. So in the interest of time, we'll move on. Angela and I were then asked to participate in a response to the LDS Church's essay on DNA in the Book of Mormon. And we wrote an article that was our first draft for this book that would be published by Signature Books, called the LDS Gospel Series, A Scholarly Engagement. Ask the question of, why do Mormons need native bodies to validate their beliefs? What is so important about having native bodies for settlers to have or justify their own belief? That essay went through some changes. Our editors, Matthew Harris and Newell Bringhurst, were much more interested in a summary of the LDS gospel topics essays and kind of a response that emphasized what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses of it. And that's the essay that we ultimately produced for that. But we left a lot of our early draft on the drawing board. We pulled it out and didn't publish it in that article. But that left us with this body of work that was out there and unpublished. Meanwhile, Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, produced a volume inviting Indigenous scholars to submit articles and produce an excellent collection of articles that was then discussed in an online forum, a podcast from Dialogue. And in that podcast, what I think is important to emphasize is that the Indigenous scholars were taking some recent statements from the president of the LDS Church, President Nelson, about the Book of Mormon not being a history or not being a textbook, and kind of an example of that shifting rhetoric in the LDS Church, and emphasizing that we need different approaches to the Book of Mormon that are not based in history. And again, for those that want to follow the links, you can watch those segments from my slideshow. Another group of, well, many of the same Indigenous scholars and collaborators came together, this time organized by Farina King, a Dene scholar, and Michael Ng, a Native Hawaiian scholar, to produce a series of workshops on Indigenous perspectives on Lamanite identity. The first of those was held at the University of Utah in 2022, and the second at Claremont Graduate University in 2023. And here, most everybody participating except for myself and Amanda Hendricks Komodo were Indigenous scholars. And we will be producing another volume, another anthology called Written to the Lamanites that looks at the Book of Mormon from Indigenous perspectives. We will be previewing that at the Mormon History Association meetings in Ogden, Utah in a couple of months. But this is kind of some of the stuff that was happening along the way. Meanwhile, as I said, there had emerged a heartland geography that was in resistance to the Mesoamerican model that was popular at farms in BYU, championed in particular by Rod Meldrum, who is the person engaging in this racialization, as I described it, of DNA evidence in a way that is absolutely contradictory towards the science of genetics itself. And as a result of that, Angelo, Simon, and I were getting repeated requests to respond to the Heartland model. Some of our responses included on Mormon book reviews and on Mormon stories. These are included in links here. The next one I want. And not only were we getting these requests from people interested in the Book of Mormon, we were getting them from Indigenous scholars as well. Hemoperiki Simon, a Maori scholar who is not affiliated with any of the restoration branches, has produced this really path-breaking series of articles asking for collaborative work between Indigenous scholars and Book of Mormon and Mormon scholars in general, and emphasizing the work that Angela and I have been doing as a model for what could be done, and asking us to ask the difficult questions about the appropriateness of prescribing a religio-colonial identity upon Indigenous groups or people. In other words, assuming that Indigenous people are Lamanites, and moving the church towards non-historical readings of the Book of Mormon. So those currents come together in 2022 at the same time that all of these changes are happening within the field of Book of Mormon studies and Mormon studies and Indigenous studies. I get a request from the editor of Journal of Northwest Anthropology to do a follow-up piece on collaborations between Indigenous science and Western science. And so I pitched to them looking at the Book of Mormon studies and Kennewick Man as an example of that. Kennewick Man being a very important subject to the readers of this journal, many of which are those Indigenous scientists, as well as anthropologists working with, in some cases, against them. And so we pitched the idea, we went through the rigorous peer review process and came out with an article that I will give you just a few highlights to take away from. You can read the article yourself. It's linked in the slideshow, but some highlights to take away in summary. The Ancient One's genome, that is the DNA from the Ancient One, soundly refutes any claims that Kennewick Man is related to Book of Mormon populations. His X2A mitochondrial lineage is basal, or that is foundational, ancestral, to that found elsewhere in the Americas, and did not come from the ancient Near East. His closest relatives are today's Native Americans, including members of the Colville Confederated Tribes who had petitioned for his repatriation. And in fact, the Ancient One would be repatriated based upon this scientific evidence. The measurements of the Ancient One's skulls fall within the range found among other Native Americans and are not indicative of a European or a white race in ancient America. Natives who oppose the repatriation of the Ancient One are not anti-science. Tribes like the Umatilla, for example, support science and employ scientists in their government. I worked alongside these scientists employed by the tribes. The debate was not a creation versus evolution one. Rather, it was over whether or not Native Americans had a say in how scientists and others treated the remains of their ancestors. That was the issue at concern. And lastly, and most importantly to this group, there is an indigenous alternative to debates between Mesoamerican and Heartland geographies. This approach treats the Book of Mormon as one figurative settler colonial version of many indeterminate origin stories. That is, not absolute truth, but stories that may have a mix of science and fiction, truth and fiction together. Indigenous peoples have stories of their own that should be shared and discussed alongside that in the Book of Mormon, as well as the portraits of the past generated by scientists. And we would argue ethically that it is absolutely inappropriate to present the Book of Mormon as a history of ancient America without also presenting indigenous sacred texts alongside the Book of Mormon. That indigenous sacred texts need to be part of the discussion. In conclusion, Lamanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics that I published in 2001 demonstrated that no DNA evidence supporting migrations described in the Book of Mormon had been found. More than 20 years later, Science and Fiction, Kennewick Man, the Ancient One, and Latter-day Saint Discourse, published in 2022, again demonstrates that there's no affirmative evidence from DNA to support narratives of Hebrew migrations to the Americas. Latter-day Saints need to set aside historical claims of the Book of Mormon and accept that indigenous peoples have stories of their own. To put it in the words of P. Jane Hafen, the Taos Pueblo scholar whose afterword in Decolonizing Mormonism is a must-read for every scholar of the Book of Mormon, she says, listening to natives tell their own stories about their own origins is a decolonizing act. Thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you, Thomas. I am so pleased to have invited you and to hear what you have to share. Numerous questions on my tablet here, but I want to begin with one and then open things for other people to get theirs in, and I'll take my turn as the rest of the people get a chance too. But I want to go back to one of your very early comments about your research with peyote and the word of wisdom.
Yeah.
I'm curious if perchance you encountered the work by Frederick Madison Smith, whose dissertation was on peyote and who was exploring or inviting, at this time, this would be 1916, and he'd just been ordained in 1914 to be prophet of the RLDS, but he was encouraging people to explore other cultural spirituality, and the peyote element was part of that. And so I'm curious if that got into your study.
It did in the aftermath, because I presented this work at the John Whitmer Historical Association annual meetings, but I was focused on a different branch of the restoration known as the Peyote Way Church of God. And so the focus was on that group, and I didn't discuss the larger restoration movements in that particular paper, but the audience members were very quick to point out exactly what you just did. That work of Frederick Madison Smith. I have it on my bookshelf over here. One of my aspirations in the future is to write more about that. It's absolutely fascinating approach. And if Frederick M. Smith is any indication of how we might interpret Joseph Smith, it really it's profoundly important. Let's put it that way.
Thank you. And I'd like to second that, because my own perception is that through the Smith family, we have not only a remarkable spiritual DNA, but there is really quite an effective academic one as well. And
Yeah.
and that shows up periodically, not necessarily in every individual. But I am impressed that here was somebody who reconciled his spiritual and scientific understanding and used them quite to advantage. Let me give a quick example. His father, Joseph III, asked for people to drink out of the common cup for communion. Fred M. had a microscope. He saw germs. His father didn't see those germs. So Fred M., when he took over as leader of the church in 1914, began to advise people to move to separate cups of the communion. The Spanish flu hit in 1918, and 20 million people died from the Spanish flu, but not so many from his followers.
There's a very significant reason that we should consider both science and religion together.
It is exactly. Thank you. Let's open it up to the other people who have their hands up.
Okay, we got quite a few with their hands up, so let's please be patient. And Monty, you'll be first, and then David DeBarth. Go ahead, Monty.
Okay, this may sound kind of nitpicky,
Mhm.
but when you use the word Dene, were you speaking specifically of Navajo?
Oh yes. Dene is the term that Navajo people use for themselves, especially the scholarly community. But it's interchangeable with Navajo.
Thank you.
David, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Thomas. I really appreciate your presentation. Very, very thought-provoking. I wanted to explore with you very briefly, if I totally set aside the Book of Mormon, I'll have asked for you to do that. Totally set aside the Book of Mormon. Is there any evidence in the indigenous people's material that would support Christ in Americas?
That's the subject of my next book. So there depends on how you want to. Well, let me put it this way. In 1820s in New York, there were indigenous writings, particularly that by a Tuscarora author by the name of David Cusick, who shared in a book called Sketches of the Ancient History of the Six Nations, stories of a Jesus-like old man who visited the Tuscarora, shared his teachings, and in this story dies he also shares a prophecy that basically people would come from across the sea in the future and would mistreat them. And that in this story, he dies. The other thing that this Jesus-like character does is he told about being murdered by the people across the water, and that when he died in the Tuscarora story, he dies a natural death. So that the colonists are presented in this narrative as murderers of Jesus, while the Tuscarora and other Haudenosaunee or Iroquois peoples are presented as more receptive to the Christian message and more willing to embrace it. And so that is one of many such stories. I provide a chronicle of those stories in Haudenosaunee, or Haudenosaunee is the term preferred by the Iroquois people or the Six Nations for themselves. So the focus is on those stories. The book will be coming out from the University of Utah Press. I will be coming back to discuss it in this forum. It's entitled Unsettling Scripture, Iroquois and the Book of Mormon. There's also a summary of that coming out in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. That will come out after the book in winter of 2025, and that is called White is a Night, Mormons' Misappropriation of the Haudenosaunee Great Peace Narrative, or the Haudenosaunee Great Peace. So the short answer to your question is yes, there are stories like that. They are in response to colonialism, and they are not dependent on a historical reading, although some of them advocate that.
I'm not sure what you mean by dependent on a historical reading.
They are not dependent on seeing that as an ancient event in the Americas. That it's more of a seeing Christ as being able to manifest himself in many different ways in many different times and places. It's not, those stories have value regardless of whether or not that old man that David Cusick wrote about ever actually existed.
Okay, so my question would be more appropriate if I said Christ or his disciples.
There are stories of both. In the Haudenosaunee versions, it's primarily of Christ. In my book, the one I'm working on with Sahira Barojas, who's on the call here, my next book that I'm working on is tentatively entitled An Iroquois Quetzalcoatl, Colonial Christologies and the Book of Mormon. And in the Quetzalcoatl narratives, there is an emphasis much more on Quetzalcoatl as a prophet, as a missionary, and in many cases, what we see, that the way that story makes its way to Western New York in the 1820s is as Quetzalcoatl as St. Thomas. And so there are both of those types of narratives, but the Iroquois ones are really the more Christ-centered, and the Nahuatl narratives, if we generalize, are more apostolic.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to your book.
Yeah. Thank you.
Rick, go ahead, please.
All right. Trying to turn my camera on. There it is. So, Thomas, good to see you again.
Yes, Rick.
I know that you want to get more indigenous voices in the Book of Mormon, and I'm curious what you think of Chief Mitiga, who's been making the rounds lately. You know, he was making a lot of noise in Heartland circles as saying that the Book of Mormon related a lot to some of the native traditions, and I don't remember which tribe he's with. And then he recently, well, he turned off a lot of the Heartlanders because he was denigrating some of the LDS Church, and he recently, of course, just joined the Bickertonite Church. So I guess I'll stop there. I got more questions, but I'll stop there.
Well, Rick, I have been following that with intense interest, trying to withhold judgment, and until I hear more and more of the story. So I want to be cautious in what I say. Saying that I hope to learn more before I address this in any publications. But I will say there are some things about his story that I find troubling, and some things about his story that I find absolutely fascinating. And the parts that make me concerned are some of the identity issues related to his claims of being well, his indigenous claims. And I'll address this kind of through a personal perspective. I too have indigenous ancestors, but I don't claim to be indigenous. I don't claim to be a chief. I don't claim even to be a Mohawk, which is what the tribal community that my ancestors came from. I was raised in southern Idaho in a white family with a white identity, and the Book of Mormon, as it was taught to me, was used to justify a narrative of almost a white supremacy, really. And our indigenous ancestors were whitewashed, literally, in the way that they were presented in the stories that I learned them. And so I'll say that I would take a very different tact, or I do take a very different tact in relationship to my indigenous ancestry than he does with his. And the thing that I find fascinating is his claims about, particularly about the peacemaker, the Iroquois peacemaker that I just discussed in the last question. And his claims about similarities between Medawewin lodge ceremonies in the Ojibwe. He claims an Ojibwe identity. Ojibwe is the indigenous preferred term for what are known as the Chippewa. And what I find fascinating about that one is that, yes, there are these peacemaker narratives. And what I try to do in my Unsettling Scripture book is go to the sources, go to those early sources of those peacemaker narratives, and see how what we can learn from those and how they change over time in relationship to the needs and interests of the people who are telling the stories, whether the indigenous people telling the stories or settlers telling the stories, and who's telling the story change the story itself. That's the sort of thing that I look at in the book. The other thing that's quite fascinating about his claims about the Medawewin, so the Medawewin lodge ceremonies are, a subject of considerable interest in American Indian religious studies, and those do appear to have co-evolved with Masonic and Christian narratives. And so the Medawewin lodge ceremonies are actually quite similar to what you see in Masonic lodges and what you see in various temple ceremonies throughout the Restoration. And I would say in the Medawewin narratives, there's a strong emphasis on Nanaboso, who is an Algonquian characters. There are some parallels with the peacemaker in Iroquois narratives, and there's actually probably some exchange of ideas occurring between Algonquian and Iroquoian speakers. Algonquian is the language family that the Ojibwe or the Chippewa people belong to. Iroquoian is the language family that the Iroquois belong to. So there's some exchange of stories occurring in the 18th century around this stuff. And the Metaweewan religion as it's practiced today largely owes its roots to that 18th century mixture of Christianity, Masonry, and indigenous traditions. And so I find that fascinating. I would like to know a lot more. And maybe that's another book down the road, because, well, I'm fascinated with the way that indigenous and Christian and Masonic traditions come together in their Mormon forms, but also in the Metaweewan forms. And there's also Iroquoian forms as well. And that triad of Masonry, indigenous traditions, and Mormonism actually helped shape American Masonry as well. And I just find that fascinating. But I would say that I have much to learn on this topic.
Cool, thanks.
Sorry about the train. Lincoln and then Jerry.
I have a question about like overall like decolonization of Mormonism, which is a topic I've been interested in for a while, for the past several months. Like how can like an ethical decolonial frame of Mormonism be constructed so that our faith doesn't create perpetuate toxic power structures. And I assume besides the resources that you've shared in the PowerPoint and the discussion today, are there any resources you would recommend for people trying to learn more about these topics?
Well, let me first highlight what I think are some of the most important ones to answer that question in what's in the slides. I really think that P. Jane Hafen's Afterword to Decolonizing Mormonism is a must read. And that's where she articulates the indeterminate versus determinate approaches to origin stories. And I think that Elise Boxer's essay in Essays on American Indian and Mormon History is also a must read for any scholar of the Book of Mormon. And she argues that the Book of Mormon does significant harm to indigenous communities by amalgamating all of indigenous communities together as if they were one, a Lamanite community, and that it denies the diversity of cultures, traditions, beliefs, and relegates that diversity to the side and puts it all together as one. By taking the Book of Mormon as one of many scriptures and recognizing that indigenous communities have been producing scriptures of their own since the colonial encounters, and treating those alongside the Book of Mormon, I think, are some great approaches to addressing this problem. The other thing that I would emphasize is questions over answers. And this is where Vine Deloria's work is especially helpful, in that indigenous traditions resonate mostly on the questions they ask, not on the particular answers that they give. And so the answers are seen as contingent. The answers are seen as reflective of individual peculiarities, of cultural differences. But the questions are perennial. the questions remain. And that's what I try to address in my dissertation, is an approach of the Book of Mormon by the questions that it asks more than the answers that it gives. And so, you know, Joseph Smith, I think, must have been troubled by the settler colonialism he saw in his own society. And so he was asking questions about it. He was trying to understand why a Christian society would abuse indigenous people in such ways that they are doing. And, you know, he sought understanding in his own worldview, in his own context, and he turned to racial justifications for slavery as an explanation of a dark skin as a curse from God. If we disregard that answer he came up with, the question is still relevant. Why is there injustice? Why, you know, yeah, I mean, I could go on, but I think I'd suppose to Divine Gloria's work, God is Read, in particular, his book, God is Read, as one place to look there as well. Yeah, I hope that answers your question, Lincoln.
What was the second resource you mentioned right after? It was after the afterword to
Yeah, Elise Boxer's
Decol-
essay, The Book of Mormon as Settler Colonialism, as Mormon Settler Colonialism. It's in
the Book of
Essays
Mormon,
The Book of Mormon as Mormon Settler Colonialism.
Mormon
It's in,
settler colonialism.
yeah, it's in Essays on American Indian and Mormon History from the University of Utah Press.
American Indian and Mormon history.
Yes, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History.
University of Utah Press.
Yeah, so that's one
Okay.
of the ones you'll see in the slideshow.
Okay. I'm gonna go. Thank you.
Yeah,
That's very helpful. I really appreciate that.
thank you.
Okay, Jerry Grover and then Blair.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I guess this is more of a legal question. When you're talking about repatriation, let's say Kennewick Man, or it could be Hopewell, anything. Which group how do they determine who has the right for that repatriation, like tribal or something that old? How do you establish which tribe is just the territory that it's found in based on their current, at least tribal assertion? I don't know. I'm not sure how that works legally.
So there's the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act is the regulatory framework for that process. And it does require consideration of where it's found, of cultural connections, as it's, yeah, the age, the scientific data, etc. It's all important in determining it. In the past, that responsibility relied primarily on the institutions that are holding those remains, and they were to notify the potential the tribes with a potential cultural affiliation of their collections, and allow the tribes to petition for the repatriation. Then at that point, the responsibility is placed on the tribes to show that cultural affiliation. And this did change a little bit under the Biden administration when Deb Haaland became the Secretary of Interior, where more of that responsibility, or less of that responsibility, falls on the tribes and more on the institutions. But certainly all those and the amount of factors that could come into play expanded under the Biden administration. Whether that's going to hold under the current administration is a doubtful question.
So I guess for Kennewick Man, who has I mean, have they gone out and said tribes that are interested, and then they've had response back? Are there tribes that are interested, multiple tribes?
Yes, there were multiple petitions, and in the end, when they did, well, so I mean, I can give you a little bit of the history there. The tribes requested right away the repatriation. The Army Corps of Engineers agreed to repatriate, and then a group of scientists sued the Army Corps of Engineers to stop the repatriation process. And what they wanted was a more thorough analysis of the data and the right of scientists to participate in that analysis, rather than the Army Corps of Engineers coming to its own conclusion based upon its scientists and the Native community. In that,
Was that like an archaeological association or something? I mean,
well, in that those court cases, there was archaeological evidence was considered, linguistic evidence was considered, biological evidence was considered, and according to the Army Corps of Engineers, all of those supported the claimant tribes.
so which side?
But the scientists.
What group of scientists are we talking about that were just individual people, or was it?
It was individuals, but they kind of allied together. And if you want to see their perspective, a good place to look is the book Kennewick Man, edited by Doug Owsley. He was one of those claimant scientists, and it's just called Kennewick Man, and it's a huge volume of the analysis. The scientists were ultimately successful in getting a more thorough analysis. Okay. And that more thorough analysis made it absolutely clear, especially the DNA evidence that came after that Doug Owsley book, but that the DNA evidence made it absolutely clear that there were genetic descendants of Kennewick Man among the claimant tribes. And so the skeleton was repatriated even with that more thorough analysis.
Which tribe did it go to then?
It went to a collection of tribes, that the claimant tribes. They collaborated on how to rebury the remains. So that included the Umatilla, the Colville. The Umatilla refused to submit any DNA samples. They felt that was invasive, and that they had already established the case without it. The Colville did submit DNA samples as part of their petition. Those are the DNA samples that were shown to be descendants. So it was to the advantage, I suppose, of the Colville that they were willing to submit their own DNA samples. In the end, that was the final clincher, was the DNA.
Did they attempt to inter like in as close proximity as they can to the original location, or I don't know how that.
It's an undisclosed location. They don't want people to know where it's at.
Yeah, I guess I'm just saying they don't attempt to try to they determine where they want it. They don't have. They're not trying to put it back in similar proximity or anything.
It depends on who the repatriation goes to, the decisions of that local tribal community. In Utah, a lot of those end up at This Is the Place monument. There is a big,
like an area where the repatriation.
Yeah, it's like a big vault underneath the This Is the Place monument, where this is where the remains that are not clearly, they've not been able to establish a clear affiliation, but they still want to repatriate. The tribes of Utah have come together and agreed they want these placed in that vault. And so that's what happens in Utah as an example. And that's particularly with the ones where they're not able to establish a clear cultural affiliation.
Yeah,
many tribes may have a claim.
Yeah, we had discovered a burial on a project we're working on, and they came. I just didn't know what happened after that, you know, when the state archaeologists come down and do their investigation. And then, I mean, I think they knew which tribe this one was, but pretty clearly. So, okay. Yeah, that's my question. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. Blair and then Rick. Go ahead, please, Blair.
You're muted.
Unmute, Blair. You're muted.
Should be down the bottom left-hand corner of your screen that says audio.
There
Having
you
trouble.
are.
I can hear you now. I can hear you now.
Having trouble getting my cursor down there.
Yeah, I had that same trouble at the beginning.
Sometimes it doesn't do what I want it to do. I was very interested in your presentation. My areas of interest, however, are not so much with the indigenous people as in the science.
Mhm.
And it's been a long time since I've done any studying of this DNA. But when I did back in the early 2000s, I developed a kind of a personal consensus, and I want to ask you if my understanding is correct, because I believe in science. I'm a scientist myself, and I believe in science, but I don't believe in everything that science says about. There are a lot of things that I disagree with in science.
Right. You know, any good scientist should be skeptical, right? So
There you go.
you're in good company here.
I want to be. I want to explain to you what I think the geneticists did, as I recall, and I came up with a conclusion that I want to ask you about.
Okay.
In my understanding, when the geneticists went into these different parts of the world to study these things like they do in, when they came up with a conclusion that there was no evidence of any European descent in the people of the native peoples, they made a selection of the people that they were going to study by very carefully finding areas of people rather homogeneous type that were isolated from other persons or from other groups. And they chose those and they went all over the world looking for those people that were homogeneous, rather homogeneous in their DNA structures. When it came to the studying of the Americas, they found people from the northernmost of North America to the southernmost tip of South America that had mitochondrial M3 markers that indicated the people came from Asia. Now, that was the group that they keep talking about is M3.
The M3 is on the patrilineal rather than matrilineal line.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what was the maternal line? Well,
The maternal lines, they identified by name or by letters. A, B, C, D, and X are the 5 most prominent Native American lineages. And A, B, C, and D are also only found in Asia. X is found more broadly. It's found in Africa, in Europe, and Southwest Asia as well. And that's why the X lineage has been the one that Mormons have been most interested in, is because it's the only one that has any overlap with the ancient Near East, although that overlap is much, much earlier in time than the events of the Book of Mormon.
All right, that fits my hypothesis also.
Yeah.
My,
Well, go ahead. Did you have more question?
my hypothesis was that it was the lineage of the Jaredites that goes from the northernmost to the southernmost tip. From what you said, that would match with the idea that people came from Asia.
That is something that I think even Hugh Nibley before DNA had made an argument kind of along that line, based upon other biological similarities independent of DNA. And the problem is a matter of timing, in that the indigenous lineages are just much, much, much older than anything in the Book of Mormon, and pointing to a migration,
Would be.
in the, tens of thousands of years ago.
All right.
And the other thing is, you're right that some of the early population studies were looking at more isolated communities. That was, a limitation of the technology that was available at the time. Today, we have much more rigorous technology and computing abilities than we had in those days. And so now a lot of the studies are looking at, so there is migration from Europe and Africa to the Americas, but they're looking at the timing of that. Okay, so they can take somebody that's got a lot of mixture of DNA from different parts of the world, and through some comparative analyses, determine the timing of those migrations. And what we find in those types of studies that have been pretty predominant throughout Latin America, is that there's a strong signature of those migrations from Spain and Portugal beginning in the 16th century, that appears in the genetics of mixed peoples in Latin America. So that evidence is perhaps some of the strongest that we have now, showing that there are a number of Jewish or Hebraic lineages among especially the people that were known as the conversos. These were Jews that had converted to Christianity because in 1492 Judaism and Islam were expelled from the Castilian Empire, what would become Spain.
Yeah,
And
Columbus.
so a lot of those conversos did migrate over here. So they do find those lineages in Latin America, but they have a very strong 16th, 18th century signature in comparative analyses. The other thing that's really important in more recent DNA is, if you look at Jennifer Raff's book, Origins, is a good summary of the most recent work, particularly with ancient skeletons. And absolutely none of the ancient skeletons, none of the skeletons that are older than 1492 have any of that admixture.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's been very helpful.
Yeah,
I appreciate it. And thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Rick and then Monty. Go ahead, please, Rick.
So Thomas, I'm just curious how you look at, say, non-scholars in the indigenous community. I know that Mike and Betty LaFontaine are the ones who they actually sold their house and purchased the Phoenicia ship. They're big Heartlanders. They believe the Book of Mormon's historical, and I don't know how, and maybe my perception's wrong, and you can correct this. Number one, how they fit in with these indigenous voices that you like to hear more of. And
Mhm.
number two, this is where maybe I have a misconception, but it does seem to me, and maybe I'm wrong, that some of the indigenous voices are more critical of the Book of Mormon than supportive of, say, a historical narrative. So could you comment on that?
Well, Rick, I turn to your channel so I can learn more from those voices. So thank you for including them in your presentations, and or in your Gospel Tangents podcast for those who might not be familiar with your work. And I find their stories fascinating. I don't think that an indigenous scholar or non-scholar needs to agree with me for their perspective to be given merit and value on its own terms. And I think that those stories should be shared alongside the more critical indigenous voices. I think there's space for both. I in some of the collaborative work that I've mentioned, most of it coming out of the University of Utah Press, I am collaborating with indigenous scholars who don't agree with me on the historicity question. I have no problem doing that. And we have a relationship that's built on mutual respect and an understanding that neither of us have all the answers, or none of us have all the answers. And so I think there's space for that, and I appreciate that you and others are trying to include those voices. And that is one of the things that when I was interviewed about the Heartland movement, that I did point out that they were actually probably more inclusive than Farms has been as far as indigenous voices. And that's to their credit.
Yeah, I think they're very inclusive. And just for people who may not know who Mike and Betty are, Mike is Chippewa, or hails from Chippewa tribe, and Betty is Navajo or Diné. Thanks.
Okay. Monty and then Paul. Go ahead, please, Monty.
First off, Blair, that's why they call it a cursor. The other thing is that I really feel it, rather than carrying this to precise extremes, or feel like you have everything absolutely nailed down with regard to the ancestry of this particular set of remains, being able to inter this person in a respectful uh, uh, manner that takes into consideration the history of the general population from where they come from. I think that the main goal in this should keep the scientific community and government from having free reign in how they research and distribute these remains. And I'm all for that. But I believe that when you disinter remains like that, you automatically create a responsibility to see to it that this particular set of remains is disposed of in a respectful, indigenous, I don't know how to say it, something that is in harmony with what they believe.
Yeah, I think it's a basic human right, that we ought to have some say in what is done with our ancestors. So thank you.
Thanks, Monty. Paul, go ahead. You need to unmute.
I want to thank you again, Thomas. I particularly want to express my appreciation for your efforts to try to balance the scientific and the religious. At the same time, it would appear to me this evening we hear more of the scientific, and you mentioned something about the Book of Mormon being spiritual scripture in preference to being historical. What would you highlight as the fundamental spiritual message there?
Oh, I was afraid of that question. Boy. I have to admit to having a very troubled relationship with the Book of Mormon. I do really struggle with the racism and the the lack of historicity. And again, the way that you know, I tried to recognize that Joseph Smith was working with, you know, the technology and the abilities and the culture that he was raised in, right? And he had to work from that frame. And so those parts that I find most troubling, I see as a product of his 19th century environment. But it isn't, again, the answers that he gives that I think are the most important is the questions that he asks. And I do think the questions that he asked that still can speak to us today in a spiritual way. How can we all be alike unto Christ or God, or however we understand the supernatural? How can we all be alike unto divinity and yet be plagued with all of these contentions and struggles and prejudices and have that so much a part of our world? That's a great question, right? And that's what I look for when I try to read the Book of Mormon for a more inspiring message is the questions. The other thing that this is a conclusion I've come to out of the research for that Unsettling Scripture, a book Iroquois and the Book of Mormon, is that I think the Book of Mormon alludes quite often to these indigenous stories that predated Joseph Smith, that came before him. I think in particular, I think he was aware of David Cusick's work, and so I see the Book of Mormon as pointing beyond itself to an indigenous voice that Joseph Smith couldn't quite capture. I think he aspired to, but the methods that he was using, conjuring the dead with a seer stone, those are difficult methods for anybody to succeed with, right? And so there is some, if you read carefully between the lines in the Book of Mormon, there are almost confessions of his inadequacy, his inability to do what he's trying to do. There's even, I forget the exact reference off the top of my head, but Jared Hickman points it out in some of his work, is Joseph Smith writing as if as if the dead could speak, as if the dead could speak. And so I think a charitable approach to Joseph Smith is to see himself doubting his own work, himself doubting that these things he's seeing in the seer stone are actually there, are actually coming from God in particular. And he's needing reassurance all the time from his family, from scholars, that he's on the right track. And so that, to me, means that he's uncertain of his own abilities. And if he's uncertain of his own abilities, then I don't think there's anything wrong with us being uncertain of his abilities to capture the voices of the dead. If he's acting as if the dead could speak, that's an important qualification, even in the text itself. So I think there are ways to read the text that are less colonial.
We had a very interesting presentation from Tom Moraine called The Sword of Laban,
Mm-hmm.
in which he, as a psychologist, saw the trauma that Joseph Smith went through at age 7 with his leg being chopped on and the pus being removed and so forth, and the multiple surgeries that he went through, the traumatizing effect of that that he traces into the Book of Mormon and shows, well, as far as he's concerned, the Book of Mormon is fundamentally out of Joseph's head. I appreciate the honesty and struggle with which you express yourself, and I would join with you in that. However, I'm quite content with the spiritual theme or the question and possible answer of the promised land.
Mm-hmm.
Seems to me the Book of Mormon does a beautiful job of highlighting that there is or should be a promised land for everyone. And today,
That for everyone is the important part there.
for everyone. And the concept of Zion and the concept of eternal life, these are concepts that are moving us hopefully toward that promised land. And so in that respect, I find it an inspiring book because there's so much dysfunctionality throughout our world. And yet when we learn the teachings of the Christ, learn to live in peace, we have a chance.
And if I can riff on that just a little bit, I would say that I think the Great Peace in the Book of Mormon is modeled after the Iroquois Great Peace.
Oh, really?
And
Yes, good. I see that.
yeah, and I think that well, what one thing, if you read the book carefully, what happens in the society that Christ creates after his appearance in the third Nephi, that this is an indigenous gift economy. It is not the settler colonial capitalism of 19th century America. And I think that Joseph Smith is looking at that indigenous gift economy as an alternative to the capitalist economy that he was participating in. And this is a message that's often missed by modern readers of the text who want to use the Book of Mormon to justify our present society. And I think it's actually quite a significant critique of the failures of the early United States to live like Zion might be. And I think Joseph Smith shared with many of the Christian missionaries an admiration of indigenous people in the ways that they lived with things more in common, where they shared more freely with each other, where they treated their families better than the settlers treated their families. You find those messages in the Book of Mormon too that I would also find inspiring.
Well, let me add to that. I haven't been inspired by the Iroquois code that required for a person to be sworn into the council that they take an oath to protect the tribes, the clan, the men, the women, the children, and those yet unborn. Decisions they made. And oh, if only we could get our politicians to give consideration to the children, what a difference that would make in terms of our ability to live in peace.
Yeah, thinking 7 generations ahead, for example.
Yeah, good. All right. There's another question up there.
Okay, Rick, and then James Lucas. Go ahead, please, Rick.
Oh, I think James was next. Let James go.
Okay, James, go ahead.
Okay, there I am. Okay, I apologize. I had to step away for another call, and so this subject may have come up, and I apologize if it was asked and answered already. But this is off the top of out of the blue, and I don't expect a deep, researched answer to this one, but I just want to run it by you, Thomas. There is a way of reading the Book of Mormon, if one reads it as a historical text, that would say that basically they were all Jaredites, actually. The Jaredites, by one interpretation, came through Asia and were an Asiatic people. And that would explain all the Asiatic DNA amongst Native Americans. And the tiny admixture of Middle Easterners would have been quickly, washed out over many centuries into this great Jaredite Asiatic population that dominated the Americas and that continued to be the origins of most Native Americans. That, as I said, and there's a lot of arguments as to why that's a valid reading of the Book of Mormon, which a lot of people would probably disagree with. If one were to present that argument, though, and say this is a possible reading of the Book of Mormon as historical, what would be your preliminary reaction from a scientific genetic point of view to that way of integrating the Book of Mormon as a historical text to your DNA evidence?
Yeah, I think you still end up with many of the same problems that you do with a kind of a Nephite-centric approach to the Book of Mormon. In that the timing is still way too early in the DNA. I mean, what the DNA shows really is that even our biblical narratives that the Book of Mormon itself is dependent upon are only part of the story. That they are a regional explanation of the origins as they were understood by ancient peoples. They're not a literal history of humankind, at least as I see it, that humankind have been around much longer than the texts of the Bible can explain. And so the same is true for the seeing the DNA as Jaredite. And I suppose if you extend your biblical chronology way back to 20, 30,000 years ago, you might be better able to balance the two. But I don't think most people would put Jaredites that far back. So you still have that timing. The other issues that you still have to deal with is the archaeology, right? That's got all the wrong plants and animals for the most part, and it has projected in 19th century Christianity into ancient America. It's drawn from the King James Bible. Those are all problems that are not solved by a Jaredite-centric model, where I see this indigenous approach that's being advocated by people like P. Jane Hafen. It treats the Book of Mormon figuratively. I see that as a lot easier to reconcile.
Okay, no, I just wanted to run that by you
Yeah.
as a possible alternative, which would, of course, we aren't blocking our part of that. This way of reading the Book of Mormon is to not lock ourselves into traditional Christian biblical chronology, which allows us to blow away the, tens of thousands of years that humans have been around. And as far as the other things go, well, it's getting late, so I just wanted to get your a preliminary reaction to that approach.
James, if I was going to advocate that approach, I would take a look at David Cusick's Sketches of the Ancient History of the Six Nations, because I think the Book of Ether has many allusions to David Cusick's narrative there. So that That's my tip of my hat to another way of approaching it.
So, spell Cusick for me.
David Cusick, Cusick.
Thank you.
His book, Sketches of the Ancient History of the Six Nations.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Rick, and then Lincoln.
I want to shift the topic just a little bit, keep it with Indigenous peoples though, and ask you, Thomas, if you have any thoughts on the LDS Indian Placement Program. You know, I know there's been both good and bad. The only time I've talked about it on my podcast was with Betty, and she loved it. She thought it was great for her. I know other people haven't felt that way, but just wondering what your thoughts are on the Indian Placement Program.
Excellent question. I was going to joke with you and say 3 strikes, you're out. And that is a good question. So, you know, Elise Boxer has a new book coming out on that. I'd encourage you to invite her to speak on your channel. Her book's coming out same time as mine is this fall. It'll be from the University of Oklahoma Press. I've read her dissertation, so I have some sense of where she's headed with it. What I really like about her approach is that she balances the perspectives of participants in the program with a structural analysis of power and relationships, and the way that that the placement program exploited Indigenous peoples for their labor, and sought to replace Indigenous narratives with a Book of Mormon narrative. So she's attentive both to people's experiences as well as the settler colonial power structure that's at play. And just to give you one example that I've addressed in my dissertation and in some other work, is that the way that the story of the Indian placement origins is told, it's told through the narrative of a young Dene woman or Navajo woman who requests the opportunity to camp out on a Latter-day Saint property, and so that she could go to school. It's kind of a heartwarming narrative that presents the placement program in the best light of, you know, kind of like this white savior sort of mentality of the settlers are helping out. They're assisting Indigenous people with their genuine desire to get an education. If you start the narrative there, it's a very different story than if you start with my wife Carrie's ancestor, Penina Shropshire Cottonwood, who was a servant in a home in Nauvoo, an Indigenous servant who is then married as a plural wife when she was fairly young. And then Mormons go from Nauvoo to, or at least one branch of the church goes from the Restoration goes to Utah, where they then systematically enslave Indigenous children of Shoshone and Utes and others, and Paiutes in particular, and use them as labor in Latter-day Saint homes, attempt to, in many cases, marry them as well in order to turn them white and delightsome. If you start with Penina and the Indian slavery in Utah, you end up with a very different picture of the Indian student placement program than if you start with a young woman in the 1940s who wanted to get an education.
Interesting. Thanks.
Okay, Lincoln, and then Monty. Go ahead, please.
I wanted to know if you've encountered many indigenous, what's the word? Indigenous tellings of the Book of Mormon. Like, I guess the example I'm thinking of is like the LDS Church has translated the Book of Mormon to several indigenous languages, specifically Mayan, several Mayan languages, and I believe excerpts into Navajo and a few others. But of course, those are more like institutional, like representations or like institutional variants of the Book of Mormon for indigenous communities. But are you familiar with any attempts by an indigenous community or an indigenous person to like retell, I guess a retelling, like retell the Book of Mormon for an indigenous context?
Yes, and I have my favorite of those that I used to open an essay I entitled Views from Turtle Island. What was the subtitle of that? Views from Turtle Island, Settler Colonialism and Indigenous Mormonisms. I think it's an article I wrote for the Palgrave Handbook of Global Mormonism. If if you go to my academia website and you follow the link to that article, if you click under the URL, it's not going to show the full article, but if you click under the URL, you can get a secret free link to this article. Otherwise, it's going to cost you $30 from Palgrave to look at it. But
Can you explain how to access that link again?
My academia website, look for the article Views from Turtle Island. And then when you click on the article, you'll see kind of hidden a URL option instead of seeing the article. And if you click on the URL, it's an active link to a free copy that I've kind of hidden out there. But this story, the important thing is the story. And the story argues that a couple of followers of Handsome Lake, who was the Seneca prophet, who had visions around 1799 to 1800, that parallel many stories in the Book of Mormon, I should note. That Handsome Lake, followers of Handsome Lake tutored Joseph Smith in his construction of his attempt to put indigenous stories together with the best of Christian stories to produce a text. And in that narrative, they taught him some of the Seneca picture writing that missionaries used to call hieroglyphics. And he inscribed these hieroglyphics onto the plates and then retold Haudenosaunee or Iroquois stories in a more Christian perspective so that it would resonate better with the settlers, and did it in collaboration with these followers of Handsome Lake. This is a popular story among Haudenosaunee peoples, and a big subject of my forthcoming book, Unsettling Scripture, is investigating some of the claims in those stories. But it's a fascinating retelling, and what's also fascinating about it is that in the end they give the gold plates back. That the gold plates today are said to be on the Tonawanda in Seneca Reservation, and that they still have them. That's one of the most fascinating indigenous retellings of the Book of Mormon, and one that I've spent the most time working with.
Wow.
Okay. Monty, go ahead, please.
This is a little bit more personal thing than the topics we've discussed this evening, but I wanted to let you all know that I'm not really stuck up. I love to communicate and discuss topics and things of this type, but if you try to get me on Facebook, you won't have any luck, because although I'm registered there and I show up there, my Parkinson's disease prevents me from being able to type. And so I can't answer you in a decent way. If I try to use a voice translator software, I wind up misspelling and with more misinterpretation of words that I spend half my life trying to correct these things or risk offending everybody I talk to. So
Well-
just want to let you know.
Well, Monty, I'm glad you're able to participate here. And I just thought
I
of
am too.
something
This
else.
is a blessing.
Yeah, I thought of something else in response to your question, Lincoln. That same story is discussed in 2 articles in Essays on American Indian and Mormon History. That same volume I recommended to you before. My article in that volume, as well as Lori Taylor's. She is a historian who collected that story that I just mentioned in the 1990s. I found stories like it going back to the 1940s, that some of which she wasn't aware of.
Thomas, I want to interrupt at this stage. We're about 20 minutes past 10 by my time. I have a meeting at 10 o'clock in the morning in Lamoni, and so I beg to sing us down and thank you so much for a most engaging evening. We definitely want you back as soon as you're ready to come back with your new book. And if you have other topics you'd like to bring, you can see the interest here has not waned in 2 hours, and so very much appreciate what you've offered us. Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. Oh Lord, I want to go to the promised land, the promised land, the place and people of peace. Oh, deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. Good night.
Thank you all, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.